In this episode, we're going to make AI documentation feel less like paperwork and more like a practical safety system that keeps organizations from being surprised by harm. When beginners hear documentation expectations, they often picture long reports written for auditors, but the real purpose is much simpler and more urgent. Documentation is the evidence trail that proves an organization understood what it was doing, set boundaries intentionally, and maintained oversight over time. AI is especially dependent on documentation because AI systems can be hard to explain, can change behavior as data and environments change, and can be used in ways teams did not originally intend. Without documentation, an organization cannot reliably answer basic questions like what AI systems exist, what they are used for, what data they rely on, who approved them, and how problems are detected and handled. Those unanswered questions become risk because they delay response, weaken accountability, and undermine defensibility when customers, regulators, executives, or internal reviewers demand clarity. The goal today is to build a beginner-friendly mental model of what evidence must always exist for AI use, and why those pieces of evidence matter even when the system seems to be working fine. By the end, you should be able to describe the core documentation artifacts a responsible program expects, understand how they connect to governance and monitoring, and recognize why good documentation is an investment in speed and trust, not a drag on progress. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first thing to understand is that documentation is not one document, but a set of records that together tell the story of an AI system's purpose, design, evaluation, approval, and ongoing control. Think of it like a product label plus a maintenance log plus a decision history, all focused on preventing confusion and protecting people. A product label tells you what something is and how it is meant to be used. A maintenance log tells you what changed and what was checked, and a decision history tells you who approved the risks and why. AI needs all three because the risk is not only in the model itself, but in how the organization uses it and how that use evolves over time. If you only document technical details, leaders cannot defend the decision. If you only document business intent, operators cannot maintain the system safely. If you do not document approvals, accountability becomes vague and blame gets shuffled during incidents. A strong documentation expectation aligns these pieces so each audience has what it needs, which is how you keep AI use understandable and controllable across teams and over years. A foundational documentation expectation is a clear, plain language statement of intended use, because AI systems are often misused when their purpose is not defined tightly. Intended use documentation explains what the system is supposed to do, what decision or process it supports, and what the organization considers a successful outcome. It also clarifies what the system is not supposed to do, which matters because people naturally push tools into new roles when they see convenience. A beginner mistake is assuming a system's purpose is obvious from its name, but names are often vague, and different teams interpret them differently. Intended use should describe the input, the output, the user of the output, and the decision context, because those details define impact. This documentation also helps with transparency because it gives a stable description that can be shared internally and sometimes externally to explain how AI is being used. It supports governance because it anchors approval decisions in a concrete description rather than in marketing language. When an incident happens, intended use also helps investigators determine whether harm came from the system behaving badly or from the system being used outside its boundaries. Closely tied to intended use is documentation of impact and risk classification, because not all AI uses deserve the same level of oversight. Impact documentation explains who is affected by the AI outputs and what kinds of harm could result if the system is wrong. It often includes whether the use case influences customer rights, employee opportunities, safety outcomes, financial outcomes, or legal obligations. Risk classification records the organization's determination of whether a use case is low impact, medium impact, or high impact, and what that classification implies for controls, monitoring, and approvals. This matters because governance should scale with impact, and without a recorded classification, teams will argue about oversight requirements every time. Impact documentation also supports consistent decision-making across the organization, which is critical when AI adoption grows. Beginners sometimes think classification is subjective, but the goal is not perfect objectivity. It is consistent criteria that leaders can defend. If leadership is asked why a high-impact system had minimal review, the absence of classification evidence makes the organization look careless. If the classification exists and is tied to clear criteria, the organization can show it made an intentional decision and applied requirements appropriately. Another non-negotiable evidence category is data documentation, because data is one of the strongest drivers of AI behavior and one of the fastest paths to privacy and fairness harm. Data documentation should identify the sources of data used, the types of data involved, and any sensitive or regulated categories included. It should also record how data was collected, what permissions or legal bases apply, and what constraints exist on its use. Even when an organization uses vendor systems and does not train its own model, it still needs to document what data is fed into the system during operation, because that operational data can be exposed or misused. Data documentation also includes data quality considerations, like known gaps, known biases, and known limitations in representation. It should clarify how data is retained, shared, and protected, because those choices determine privacy and security risk. Beginners should recognize that without a clear record of data sources and data flows, it becomes almost impossible to investigate issues like bias, drift, or unexpected leakage. Data documentation is also critical when someone asks whether the AI system used information it should not have used, because the organization needs evidence, not assurances. Evaluation and performance documentation is another category of evidence that must always exist, because relying on AI without evidence of how it performs is the definition of unjustified trust. Evaluation documentation records how the system was assessed before deployment, what measures were used, what results were observed, and what limitations were discovered. For many organizations, this includes baseline performance measures like accuracy, but the more important evidence is how performance behaves in the specific context where the system will be used. That includes how it performs on edge cases, how often it produces high-confidence wrong outputs, and what types of errors are most common. If fairness is a concern, evaluation documentation should include how outcomes differ across relevant groups and contexts, and whether disparities exist that are unacceptable. The document should also record assumptions made during evaluation, because assumptions define what the evidence actually proves. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking evaluation proves a system is correct, when evaluation really proves how the system behaved in specific tests under specific conditions. Recording those conditions and limitations is what prevents later overreach, because teams can see what the system was never proven to handle. If the organization cannot show it evaluated the system responsibly, it will struggle to defend its reliance on that system after harm occurs. Governance and approval records are another essential evidence category, because decision-making without traceability is not defensible. Approval documentation should show who approved the use case, what conditions were attached to approval, and what reviews were completed, such as privacy review, security review, legal review, and risk assessment review. It should also record decision rights, meaning who had authority to approve and who had authority to block. This matters because in AI use, responsibility often becomes blurry, and without records, it becomes easy for everyone to claim someone else approved it. Approval records also help teams understand what they promised to do, like monitoring requirements, human review requirements, or restrictions on use. When organizations grow and people change roles, approval documentation becomes the memory of the program. Without it, systems can remain in use long after their original justification has expired, and no one knows what the original safeguards were supposed to be. Beginners should see approval records as part of operational safety, because they ensure the organization can answer the question of who decided this was acceptable and why. A related but often forgotten evidence category is documentation of controls and oversight, meaning what safeguards exist to keep risk within tolerance. Control documentation describes what humans and processes do to prevent harm, detect harm, and correct harm, and it ties those controls to ownership. This might include human review requirements for high-impact decisions, limits on automation, requirements for escalation, and requirements for incident reporting. It also includes training expectations for users, because misuse risk is often controlled through education and policy reinforcement. Oversight documentation should clarify who monitors the system, what they monitor, and how often they review results. It should also clarify what happens when monitoring indicates a problem, such as who has authority to pause the system and who must be notified. Beginners sometimes assume controls are only technical, but many effective controls are procedural, like requiring human sign-off for certain actions or requiring documented justification for exceptions. Recording controls is important because it prevents the organization from assuming controls exist when they do not. It also helps auditors and leadership see that risk was not ignored, but actively managed through defined safeguards. Change and lifecycle documentation is another required evidence area because AI systems are rarely static, and change is a major source of drift and surprise. Lifecycle documentation records what version of a model or system is in use, what updates were made, what data sources changed, and what reevaluation occurred after changes. Even small changes, like adjusting input fields or changing a vendor configuration, can affect AI outputs in significant ways, and without a record, teams may not connect a new problem to a recent change. Lifecycle documentation also covers the idea of retirement, meaning what happens when the organization stops using a system, how data is handled, and how dependencies are removed. This matters because old AI systems can continue influencing decisions in hidden ways, especially if they are embedded in workflows. Beginners should recognize that change records support both accountability and troubleshooting, because when something goes wrong, you need to reconstruct what the system was at that time, not what it is today. Without lifecycle documentation, organizations rely on memory, and memory is unreliable during incidents. A disciplined change record also discourages informal tweaks, because teams know changes must be recorded and reviewed. Monitoring and incident documentation is another category of evidence that must always exist, because AI risk is not only about preventing problems, but also about noticing and responding quickly when problems appear. Monitoring documentation explains what signals are tracked, how performance and drift are measured, and what thresholds trigger action. It should also include reporting expectations, such as who receives monitoring updates and how often. Incident documentation covers what happens when the AI system contributes to harm, including how incidents are reported, investigated, and resolved. It should record the timeline, the impact, the root causes, and the corrective actions taken. This documentation is not only for accountability, it is for learning because it helps the organization improve controls and prevent recurrence. Beginners often assume incidents are rare, but in AI systems, small incidents may occur frequently, like recurring incorrect outputs that require manual correction. Recording these patterns helps identify systemic risk before it becomes severe. Monitoring and incident evidence also supports leadership decisions about whether to continue using a system, tighten boundaries, or redesign the use case. A useful way to see documentation expectations as a coherent system is to think of documentation as answering 7 simple questions that come up in every serious review. What is the system? What is it used for? And what is it not used for? Who is affected, and what harm could occur if it fails? What data does it use, and where does that data come from? What evidence shows it performs acceptably, and what limitations were found? Who approved it? Under what conditions? And who owns oversight? What controls and monitoring keep it within tolerance, and what triggers escalation? What changes have occurred, what incidents have happened, and what was learned? If your documentation set can answer those questions clearly, the organization can move faster because it can make decisions without reinventing the story each time. If the documentation cannot answer those questions, the organization slows down in the worst way through confusion, conflict, and crisis response. Beginners should see that good documentation is a tool for speed and safety because it reduces repeated debate and improves response when issues arise. Now let's connect documentation expectations back to the exam mindset, because Domain 2 is often about program execution and evidence discipline. When you see a scenario where an organization cannot explain an AI decision, cannot show what was evaluated, or cannot identify who approved a use case. The problem is often missing documentation, not just technical failure. The best answers in these scenarios typically involve establishing minimum evidence requirements, creating consistent templates or records for submissions, and enforcing documentation before deployment for high-impact uses. If a scenario involves drift or bias emerging over time, strong documentation around monitoring, thresholds, and change history becomes essential to show responsible oversight. If a scenario involves vendor AI tools, documentation about contracts, data flows, limitations, and responsibilities becomes central because vendor relationships can hide risk if not documented. Documentation is also tightly linked to defensibility because when regulators or executives ask what the organization did to manage AI risk, documentation is the proof. Without proof, even reasonable choices can look negligent. For beginners, this is why evidence discipline is not optional. It is the backbone of a credible AI risk program. To close, AI documentation expectations are about ensuring evidence always exists that the organization understood the AI system, made deliberate decisions about its use, and maintained control over time. The core evidence set includes intended use and boundaries, impact and risk classification, data sources and data handling, evaluation results and limitations, governance approvals and decision rights, controls and oversight responsibilities, lifecycle change history, and monitoring and incident records. Each category matters because it supports a different part of defensibility, from explaining purpose to proving accountability to detecting problems early. Documentation is not about writing for its own sake. It is about preserving clarity in a complex environment where AI can scale decisions quickly and where confusion can become harm. When documentation is consistent and complete, the organization can respond faster, learn from issues, and justify its choices under scrutiny. This documentation foundation will support the next steps in building an effective AI risk program, because you cannot manage what you cannot describe, and you cannot defend what you cannot prove.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.